I need the money tomorrow. My daughter ordered me, handing me her husband's debt of $400,000. And no delays, her husband added. I smiled and said, okay. 4 hours later I was at the airport. When they came to my house for the money they found only a closed door and a box, which they opened and started screaming. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The life my daughter Serafina had built for herself was a masterpiece of modern fiction, a testament to the power of a well-curated Instagram feed. Her home, a starkly minimalist mansion of glass and white marble in the city's most exclusive enclave, was less a home and more a gallery, a stage meticulously set for the unblinking eye of her social media followers. Every object within it, the single artfully placed orchid on the vast marble island, the beige cashmere throw draped with calculated carelessness over the severe Italian sofa, was chosen not for comfort or for love, but for its photogenic qualities, its ability to communicate a specific and entirely fabricated narrative of effortless luxury. Sera, at 38, was a brand curator, a title as vague and ephemeral as the life she purported to live. Her days, as far as I could tell, were a performance of this curated existence. She was a high priestess of the aesthetic, her online presence a testament to a life lived in perfect, soft focus lighting. One week she was posting from a sun-drenched infinity pool in Bali, a sponsored kaftan billowing around her, the caption full of inspirational but ultimately meaningless quotes about manifesting your best life. The next, she was in her all-white kitchen, artfully arranging a basket of organic produce for a post about clean living and intentionality. Her hundreds of thousands of followers saw a successful self-made woman, a boss babe who had built an empire on her own impeccable taste. They did not see the truth. They did not see the silent, invisible investor who funded the entire elaborate production. They did not see me. Her husband Damien was her handsome and willing co-star in this production. At 40 he was a charismatic and relentlessly ambitious man who moved through the world with the unshakable confidence of someone who has never had to truly worry about a bill. He was a tech entrepreneur, a visionary who was always on the cusp of the next big disruptive idea, an idea that always seemed to require a significant and immediate injection of capital. Together they were a power couple, a brand unto themselves, their life a beautiful seamless narrative of success, a story I had been ghostwriting for their entire adult lives. My own life, as Dr. Annelise Dubois, was a study in contrasts to theirs. As a retired neurosurgeon, my world had been one of quiet, intense focus, of life or death decisions made under the harsh, unforgiving lights of an operating room. My success was not measured in followers or brand partnerships but in lives saved, in futures restored. My home was not a minimalist gallery but a warm, comfortable Tudor filled with books, art, and the memories of a long and happy marriage to my late husband Samuel. My wealth, accumulated through a lifetime of disciplined work and shrewd, private investing, was a quiet, private thing, a source of security for me, and I had always believed, a foundation for my children. The arrangement had started after Samuel's death. A decade ago, lost in my own grief, and terrified of my children facing the harsh realities of a world without their father's guidance, I had made a decision born of love and perhaps a touch of fear. I established the Dubois Family Trust. It was designed to be a foundation, not a crutch. Upon their 25th birthdays, each of my children would begin to receive a generous monthly stipend. The amount was substantial, $7,000 each for a total of $14,000 a month. Enough, I believe, to give them the freedom to build their careers, to travel, to create without the soul-crushing burden of student debt or the terror of a missed rent payment. I didn't want them to chase salaries. I wanted them to chase their passions. It was, I had told myself then, the greatest gift a mother could give. The gift of a life without financial fear. I had envisioned my daughter Sera using this freedom to start a real, impactful business, to use her creative eye for something more than just a perfect selfie. I had dreamed of my son Adrian finally producing the powerful, socially conscious documentaries he had always spoken of so passionately. The money was not meant to be a permanent subsidy for their lives. It was meant to be the launch pad. I was giving them wings, and I waited, with a mother's hopeful and increasingly anxious heart, to watch them fly. But they had not flown. They had simply remained in the nest, a very comfortable, very expensive nest, and had forgotten that the wings were their own, not mine. Damien's ventures were always spectacular, both in their conception and in their inevitable fiery collapse. He was a man who fell in love with ideas, with the sizzle of a pitch deck and the intoxicating buzz of a board meeting where he was the star. He was a visionary, a big-picture thinker. He was, however, less interested in the tedious, practical and ultimately crucial details of actually running a business, like managing cash flow or, for that matter, generating revenue. His latest masterpiece, the one that was going to revolutionize the luxury travel space, was an app called Elysian. It promised to use a proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm to curate bespoke, hyper-personalized travel experiences for the ultra-wealthy. It was a brilliant idea, perfectly tailored to his and Sarah's brand of effortless aspirational luxury. The problem, as with all of Damien's brilliant ideas, was that it was a black hole for cash. He had funded the initial development, not through traditional, cautious venture capital, the kind that asks for business plans and proof of concept, but through a series of increasingly risky, high-interest short-term loans from shady private lenders. These were not patient bankers in suits, they were predators in expensive cars, men who operated in the gray, unregulated fringes of the financial world, and who smelled the blood in the water of Damien's desperate ambition. I knew none of this, of course, not yet. All I knew, from my occasional dutifully attended family dinners, was that Damien's talk of imminent breakthroughs and game-changing updates was becoming more frequent, more frantic. The performance of success was becoming strained, the easy smile a little too tight, the confident charm a little too bright. He was a man who was running on fumes, and the fumes were starting to smell of desperation. I would see the small, subtle signs of the rot beneath the glossy surface of their lives. A hushed, angry phone call he would take in the garden, his back to the house, his shoulders tense, a thick official-looking envelope, delivered by courier, that he would quickly stuff into his briefcase, his face a mask of feigned nonchalance. He was a man who was beginning to look haunted, a man who was running from something that was gaining on him with every passing day. But in front of me, and more importantly, in front of Sarah's hundreds of thousands of followers, the performance of effortless success continued, and even escalated. They were not just living beyond their means, they were living in a different financial galaxy, one where consequences were a concept for other, lesser people. A new leased Porsche appeared in their driveway. A spontaneous last-minute trip to Bart's for a branding conference was documented in a flurry of perfect sun-kissed selfies. A lavish redecoration of their already perfect living room, featured in a local design blog, showcased a new ridiculously expensive Italian sofa. I now realized they were not just spending, they were projecting, they were desperately trying to maintain the illusion of immense wealth and success. A financial Potemkin village designed to keep the wolves at the door by pretending the house was an impenetrable fortress. But the wolves were not just at the door, they were already inside, sitting at the table, and they were beginning to get impatient. Damien's disruptive tech venture was about to disrupt his own life in the most catastrophic way imaginable. And my daughter, his willing and enthusiastic co-star, was about to be caught in the blast. The pattern had been established years ago, a slow, creeping erosion of boundaries that I had, in my misguided and grief-stricken generosity, allowed to happen. My love for my children had been a resource, a utility, something they had learned to exploit with the casual, unthinking confidence of a person flipping a light switch, always expecting the light to come on. My wealth was not something I possessed, it was something they were owed. A few months before the final catastrophic demand, there had been a smaller but in retrospect deeply telling incident that perfectly illustrated the dynamic. Sarah had called me, her voice a whirlwind of excited, non-negotiable plans, the sound of a woman who had already made a decision and was now simply informing the accounts payable department. "Mom, you are not going to believe the space I found," she had gushed, her words tumbling out in a rush of pure unfiltered want. "It's the perfect location for the launch of my new consultancy. A ground-floor boutique space in the heart of the design district. It's an A-list location. It's a brand-defining move." She had been talking about launching her own brand consultancy for years. It was a vague, ill-defined business that, as far as I could tell, involved her having expensive lunches with other wealthy women and telling them what color to paint their walls or what kind of artisanal cheese to serve at their parties. It was a business with no clients, no income, and no discernible plan. But it had a magnificent and very expensive brand identity. "That's wonderful, darling," I had said, a familiar weariness settling over me like a heavy blanket. I knew, with the certainty of a seasoned physician diagnosing a familiar ailment, what was coming next. "The thing is," she continued, her voice shifting from breathless excitement to a tone of mild, impatient necessity, the sound of a CEO dealing with a minor logistical hurdle. The landlords are a bit old-fashioned. They're looking for a tenant with a more established financial history. They want a co-signer on the lease. A guarantor, someone with significant assets to back the lease. I see, I had said, my voice carefully neutral. So I'll email you the papers, she had said. It was not a request, it was a statement of fact, a line item on her to-do list. You just need to sign them and have them notarized and send them back. It's just a formality really, but we need to move fast. A space like this won't be on the market for long. She had framed it as an investment in her future, a simple, logical step that any supportive and wealthy mother would naturally take. To refuse, to even hesitate would be to stand in the way of her dreams. It would be an act of profound and deeply unreasonable negativity. So, against my better judgment, against the silent, screaming voice of my own financial prudence, I had signed, Dr. Annalise Dubois, a woman whose name was a symbol of financial stability and impeccable credit, a woman who had never co-signed a loan for anyone in her life, had just personally guaranteed a 5-year astronomically expensive commercial lease on a retail space for a business that existed only on an Instagram feed. It was just one incident in a long-established pattern of entitlement. There had been the seed money for my son Adrian's perpetually in-development documentary films. A series of expensive, self-indulgent projects that never seemed to progress beyond the research phase, which always seemed to involve him traveling to exotic and very photogenic locations. There had been the down payment on their first apartment, a loan that was never intended to be repaid. There had been the endless series of smaller but no less significant bailouts, a maxed-out credit card here, a forgotten tax bill there. My generosity, I was beginning to realize with a deep and profound sadness, had been a mistake. It had not been a foundation upon which they could build their own lives of substance and meaning. It had become a gilded cage, a comfortable, luxurious prison that had robbed them of the one thing that gives life its true value. The struggle, the work, the profound satisfaction of building something for yourself, with your own 2 hands. I had given them everything a person could want, and in doing so I had given them nothing at all. The day the house of cards finally, and spectacularly, began to collapse was a Thursday. Damien was in his home office, a sleek minimalist space that looked more like a tech CEO's photo shoot for a business magazine than a real place of work. He was staring at his laptop, but he was not, as he so often pretended, crushing it or disrupting the paradigm. He was watching his world burn. The email had arrived an hour earlier. It was not from a client. It was not from a potential investor. It was from his primary creditor, a shadowy private equity firm with a name like Apex Global Holdings, a name that was deliberately vague and deeply intimidating. The email was short, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. The subject line was a single chilling and very final phrase: final notice of acceleration and demand for payment. The body of the email laid out the stark, ugly terms of his complete and utter ruin. His latest desperate round of bridge funding for Elysian had, as he had known it would, failed to materialize. He had missed his last 2 substantial interest payments, a default he had been trying to hide under a flurry of cheerful, optimistic progress reports. He was, the email stated in cold, unforgiving legalese, in profound and incurable breach of his loan agreement. As a result, they were exercising the acceleration clause. They were calling in the entire debt. The number presented in a bold, angry font was a staggering, indigestible figure: $400,000. It was the total of the principal he had borrowed to keep his fantasy alive, plus a series of punitive late fees and a crippling predatory interest rate that had been compounding daily. The final paragraph was the one that made the blood drain from his face, that made the room feel suddenly terrifyingly cold. It stated, in a veiled but unmistakable threat, that the debt was now due and payable, in full, within 48 hours. If the payment was not received in their accounts by the close of business on Friday, they would not just begin legal action. They would begin all necessary and appropriate actions to recover their assets. A polite, corporate term for sending very large, very unfriendly men to his house to take his new Porsche, his wife's ridiculously expensive jewelry, and every other valuable object that was not nailed down. The email hinted, in a way that was far more terrifying than any overt threat, that their methods were not always confined to polite, legal channels. His public and personal ruin would be swift, total, and deeply, deeply unpleasant. The charismatic, confident mask of Damien, the tech visionary, the man who was about to change the world, dissolved in an instant, It was replaced by the pale, sweating, terrified face of a cornered and deeply out of his depth con man. He had flown too close to the sun, fueled by a confidence that was not his own, and his wax wings had finally and spectacularly melted. The heat was no longer a pleasant warmth. It was a raging, all-consuming inferno. He stumbled out of his office and found Sierra in the living room. She was in the middle of a live stream, an Ask Me Anything session with her followers, her face a mask of curated professional joy. Her voice a smooth, confident purr as she dispensed advice on living your most authentic life. "We have a problem," he said, his voice a raw, strangled whisper. He held out his phone, the screen glowing with the death notice of their life. I can only imagine the scene that followed. The moment the cameras were off, the screaming, the accusations, the frantic, panicked recriminations of two people whose entire beautiful and utterly fraudulent world was about to be violently and publicly dismantled by a single terrifying email. But their panic, I am sure, as it always did, quickly coalesced into a single, unified and utterly predictable solution. There was only one bank that had never failed them, only one lender who had never said no, who had never charged interest, who had never sent a threatening final notice, the bank of Mom, my bank. Their problem was not, in their minds, a problem they needed to solve. It was a problem they needed me to fix, and they needed me to fix it. Now, they called me an hour later. It was Sierra, her voice a strange, high-pitched and brittle instrument of forced, unnatural calm. The smooth, confident purr of the lifestyle guru was gone, replaced by the tight, strained tone of an air traffic controller trying to talk down a plane with two failed engines. "Mom," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "Damien and I need to have a little chat with you, a sort of urgent business meeting. Would you be free this afternoon? It's rather time sensitive." The phrase business meeting was a glaring, flashing red flag, a piece of corporate jargon so utterly out of place in our familial relationship that it immediately set my internal alarms ringing. This was not a social call. This was not a checking in. This was a summons, a desperate and, I suspected, a very high-stakes one. "Of course, darling," I said, my own voice a calm, neutral counterpoint to her frantic energy. I was a surgeon, listening to a panicked intern describe a patient who was crashing. The first step was to remain calm. "I'm home all afternoon. Shall I come to you?" "No," she said, a little too quickly, a little too forcefully. "No, we'll come to you. It's better that way. We'll be there in an hour." They arrived not in Sarah's sporty little convertible, a car I had bought her as a graduation present, but in Damien's large, black and deeply intimidating SUV, a vehicle that always seemed more like a military transport or a gangster's getaway car than a family vehicle. They pulled into my quiet circular driveway with a spray of gravel, a jarring, aggressive arrival. They walked up the stone path to my front door not with the easy casual air of children visiting their mother, but with the grim determined march of a hostile negotiating team arriving for a high-stakes corporate showdown. Sarah was in a severe all-black pantsuit, her face a mask of tense controlled urgency. Damien was in a dark suit, his tie loosened, his face a mask of grim self-important seriousness. I greeted them in my living room, a serene, comfortable space filled with the books and art I loved, the soft, golden light of the late afternoon streaming through the large bay window. I had out of a lifetime of habit prepared a tray of tea and small homemade lemon cakes, a gesture of hospitality that felt in this tense, charged atmosphere almost absurdly domestic. They did not sit. They stood in the center of the room. Two stiff, anxious figures radiating an aura of aggressive, desperate entitlement. Their eyes scanned the room, not with the warmth of familiarity but with the cold, appraising gaze of assessors. They were not seeing a home. They were seeing assets. They were seeing a solution to their problem. This was not a request for help. This was not a plea for a mother's support. This was a demand for a bailout, and they had come prepared to do whatever it took to get it. They saw me not as a mother, not as a person but as a financial institution. A living, breathing ATM. My home was not a home. It was Ain Branch, and they had come to make a very large and what they believed would be a very non-negotiable withdrawal. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet upholstery that had been my husband's, and I listened. I listened as they laid out their carefully rehearsed and deeply dishonest version of the situation, a masterful performance of curated victimhood and strategic necessity. It was a presentation, a pitch, and I was the sole and very captive audience. Damien spoke first. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, a posture he had likely seen in a movie about powerful beleaguered men. He spoke of his company's unforeseen market headwinds, of a sudden and deeply unfortunate betrayal by a key institutional investor. He framed his own reckless incompetence, his catastrophic failure, as a series of unfortunate external events, a perfect storm of bad luck that had unfairly targeted his brilliant world-changing vision. He was not a failure, he was a tragic hero, a visionary battling against the dark forces of a cruel, uncomprehending world. The performance was breathtaking in its lack of self-awareness. Sarah then took over. Her role, clearly, was to translate this epic business drama into a simple, emotional, and deeply manipulative family matter. She was the bridge between his corporate fantasy and my financial reality. "The bottom line, Mom," she said, her voice full of a false, weary patience, the tone of a brilliant person having to explain a complex concept to a very slow child, "is that Damien's primary backer has pulled out and he needs to cover a short-term loan. It's a bridge loan, just until the next round of funding, which is already secured by the way, comes through in a few weeks." A bridge loan. They were using the language of legitimate finance to describe a desperate last-minute bailout from a loan shark. The secured next round of funding was, I had no doubt, a complete and utter fiction. Then came the demand, the true purpose of this entire elaborate performance. Sarah walked over to me, her movements sharp and all business. She was no longer my daughter. She was her husband's chief financial officer, here to close a very important deal. She was holding a thick, ominous leather-bound folder. She did not hand it to me with the deference of a child asking for help. She dropped it into my lap. The folder was heavy, full of a terrifying official-looking weight. I opened it. On top was the email I now knew so well, the one with the final notice in stark red letters. And behind it a sheaf of documents detailing the loan, the predatory interest, the punitive fees. The final, terrifying number at the bottom of the page was circled in red ink, $400,000. I looked up from the documents, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The number was obscene, a testament to a level of recklessness I could barely comprehend. I looked at my daughter. Her face was a mask of hard and patient expectation. There was no shame in her eyes. There was no fear. There was only a cold, hard and absolute certainty that her problem was about to be solved. "I need the money tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was an order, a direct and utterly breathtakingly entitled command. Her voice was as cold and hard as the marble countertops in her kitchen. There was no please. There was no "can you help us?" There was no acknowledgement of the monumental life-altering sum she was demanding. There was only the raw, naked and absolute demand of a person who has come to collect a debt she believes, with every fiber of her being, that she is owed. The demand had been made. Now it was time for the threat. "Tomorrow?" I whispered, the word a small, choked sound of disbelief in the quiet, sunlit room. It was not the amount that shocked me, though it was staggering. It was the timeline, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand. "Sarah, this is a huge amount of money. It's not sitting in a checking account. It requires transfers from investment portfolios, authorizations from my financial manager. I can't just produce it tomorrow." Before I could finish my sentence, Damien, who had been standing silently by the fireplace like a brooding, self-important statue, took a step forward. He moved from the periphery of the conversation to its center, standing directly over my armchair. His large frame cast a long, intimidating shadow over me, a deliberate physical act of dominance. The charming, beleaguered CEO was gone, replaced by something much colder and much more menacing. "And no delays," he added, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was a perfect and deeply chilling echo of his wife's command. "There can be no delays, Annalise." He had never in the 15 years I had known him called me Annalise. It was always Dr. Dubois in formal settings, or in rare familial moments, Mom. The use of my first name was a deliberate act of disrespect, a stripping away of my maternal status, a recasting of our relationship as a purely transactional, and now deeply hostile one. "These are not the kind of people you keep waiting," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a veiled but unmistakable threat. "They are not a bank. They do not send polite, registered letters. They have other methods of collection. Methods that would be very, very unpleasant for all of us if the deadline is not met." The threat was clear, and it was two-pronged. He was not just warning me of the consequences to himself. He was implying, with a cold, deliberate precision, that my failure to comply would have direct and dire consequences for my daughter. For my family, he was making me responsible for their safety. A safety that had been compromised by his own reckless, idiotic and deeply selfish decisions. I looked from his hard, threatening face to my daughter's. She stood there, her arms crossed, her expression one of impatient, unwavering support for her husband. She was a full partner in this threat. A silent co-signer on his emotional blackmail. She was not the victim of his desperation. She was his willing accomplice. They were a team, a united front of desperation, entitlement, and a low-thrumming current of menace. They had come into my home, my sanctuary, a place of peace and beauty, and they had, in effect, turned it into the scene of a high-stakes shakedown. They were demanding a ransom of $400,000, to be paid within 24 hours or else. Their tone was not one of desperate, pleading children asking their mother for help. It was the tone of gangsters, of standover men demanding a payment that was their due. They were not asking for a gift. They were not asking for a loan. They were issuing an order to their personal and apparently limitless financial institution. And they were expecting my immediate and unquestioning compliance. They saw me not as a mother to be loved and respected, but as a vault to be cracked. And they believed they had just found the combination. This was the moment, the turning point. The moment that would, I knew with a sudden chilling and profoundly liberating clarity, define the rest of my life and the rest of our relationship. For years I had been the enabler. I had been the quiet, accommodating and endlessly generous source of their comfortable, beautiful and utterly fraudulent lives. I had signed the leases. I had provided the seed money. I had funded the illusion. My love and my wealth had been a blank check, and they had finally filled it in with an amount so staggering, so insulting, and a demand so brutal that it had finally triggered a stop payment in my heart. I looked at them, at my daughter, her beautiful face a mask of hard, selfish impatience, her eyes devoid of any warmth, of any love, of any of the shared history between us. At her husband, his handsome face a mask of veiled, thuggish menace, his posture a physical threat in my own living room. They were not children in trouble, seeking the comfort and help of their mother. They were predators who saw me not as a person but as a resource to be plundered, a problem to be solved. And in that moment something inside me, a part of me that had been dormant for decades, the part of me that had once been a brilliant, decisive and unflappable neurosurgeon, the part that had held lives in her hands, and had never ever flinched from a difficult decision, woke up. The soft, accommodating and endlessly forgiving mother receded, and the cold, precise and utterly ruthless mind of Dr. Annalise Dubois took control. I looked down at the documents in my lap. I looked at the terrifying red-circled number. I looked back up at their hard, expectant faces, their eyes boring into me, waiting for my inevitable and in their minds my only possible response. And I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a reassuring smile. It was a strange, calm and, I am sure, deeply unnerving smile. It was the smile of a surgeon who has just looked at a complex, life-threatening and seemingly inoperable tumor on an MRI, and has seen, with a sudden brilliant clarity, the exact, precise and perfect line of incision. The path to removing the cancer was clear. The rage, the hurt, the profound, soul-deep disappointment. It was all still there, but it was now a cold, controlled energy, a fuel for the surgical strike I was about to perform. They stared at my smile, their own aggressive, confident expressions faltering for a moment, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This was not the reaction they had expected. They had expected tears, arguments, a panicked flurry of questions. They had not expected this strange, serene and almost cheerful calm. But their own desperation and entitlement quickly reasserted themselves. They saw my lack of protest, my lack of anger, as a sign of capitulation. They believed their threats, their aggressive entitled demands, had worked. They believed I was, once again rolling over, the ever-compliant, ever-generous mother, too weak or too scared to say no. I let them believe it for a moment longer, enjoying the slow return of the triumphant, self-satisfied smirk to Damien's face, the flicker of victorious relief in Sarah's eyes. Then, I spoke one word, the word they were so desperately, so confidently waiting to hear. Okay, I said. The word was quiet, but in their ears it was a thunderclap of victory. It was a word of acceptance, a word of agreement, a word of complete and total surrender, or so they thought. The relief that washed over their faces was a palpable, almost comical thing. Sarah's hard, tense shoulders visibly relaxed, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Damien let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours, the menacing posture dissolving back into the easy confident stance of a man whose problems have just been solved. Their shared glance was a silent, arrogant confirmation. See, the old woman always comes through. She just needed a little push. They had what they wanted. They had my agreement. And they had no idea that my quiet, simple and utterly beautifully dishonest okay was not a surrender. It was a declaration of war. The moment the front door of my home closed behind them, the moment their large black SUV, a vehicle I now saw as a hearse for their own ambitions, pulled away from the curb, the calm, smiling mask of the compliant mother dropped. The retired neurosurgeon Dr. Annalise Dubois was back on duty, and she was about to perform the most precise and most ruthless operation of her life. I did not waste a single second on grief, on hesitation, on the emotional aftershock of the confrontation. The time for emotion was over. The time for action was now. My movements were a study in cold, precise and immediate efficiency, the muscle memory of a lifetime spent in high-stakes life-or-death situations taking over. My first call was not to my lawyer. It was not to my bank. It was to a high-end, discreet and incredibly efficient travel concierge service I had used for years, a service that catered to a clientele for whom money was no object and privacy was paramount. A woman named Isabel, whose job it was to make the impossible happen, answered on the first ring. "Isabel," I said, my voice all business, stripped of any warmth or pleasantry. "It's Annalise Dubois. I have an emergency, a personal matter of some urgency. I need a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland, leaving tonight. It must be the earliest possible flight out of the city. I do not care about the airline. I do not care about the cost. It just has to be tonight." Geneva was not a random choice. It was my escape hatch. A second life I had been quietly building for years. I had a small, beautiful apartment there, overlooking the lake, a place of peace and anonymity. More importantly, I had a Swiss bank account, a fortress of financial privacy that was the repository of a significant portion of my personal, non-trust fund wealth. It was the part of my fortune that my children that no one knew anything about. "Of course, Dr. Dubois," Isabel said, her voice a calm, unflappable purr. The word emergency did not faze her. It was the currency of her business. "I'm on it. I will have a confirmation and a car service arranged for you within the hour. Your usual driver will be at your door at 7. "Thank you, Isabel," I said, and hung up. Step 1. The exfiltration plan was in motion. My second call was to Mr. Ben Carter. He was the 60-something, fiercely loyal and utterly discreet manager of my private wealth and the Dubois family trust. He was a man of the old school, a man of his word who had been my late husband's most trusted advisor and had become my own. He was a man who had watched my children grow from sweet, loving kids into the grasping, entitled adults they had become, and I knew, from the weary, sad look in his eyes at our last quarterly meeting, that he had been waiting patiently for this very day. He too answered on the first ring. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice a blade of ice, the same calm, authoritative tone I had once used to command an operating room. "It has happened. I require your immediate and absolute discretion. I am emailing you a folder of documents I have just received. They detail a personal debt of $400,000 owed by my son-in-law Damien to a series of private creditors." I could hear the sharp, almost imperceptible intake of his breath on the other end of the line. "I see, doctor," he said, his voice a low, grim murmur. He did not sound surprised. He sounded ready. "Here are my instructions," I said, my words clear, precise, and not open to negotiation. "And they are irrevocable. I want you to use the discretionary fund of my personal account, not the family trust that the children are beneficiaries of. I want you to contact these creditors immediately. Use whatever means necessary. I want you to buy my son-in-law's entire outstanding debt, all of it. I want our financial entity to become his sole creditor by the end of business today." There was a moment of profound and I am sure deeply, deeply satisfied silence on his end. This was not just a financial transaction, this was a strategic move a man of prudence and fiscal responsibility could appreciate on a deep professional level. "Consider it done, Dr. Dubois," he said, and his voice was a low, dangerous purr of pure professional pleasure. "I will handle it personally." And with extreme prejudice. The surgical strike was in motion. The plan was not just defensive, it was offensive. I was not just cutting them off. I was not just refusing their demand. I was executing a move of such cold strategic genius that it had likely never even occurred to their greedy, unimaginative minds as a possibility. I was not just closing the Bank of Mom, I was becoming the new and far more formidable debt collector. The operation was underway. The beauty of the plan, the part that elevated it from a simple act of refusal to a neurosurgical strike, was in its elegant and brutal simplicity. By buying Damien's debt, I was not just refusing to be his savior. I was, in a single brilliant financial maneuver, transforming myself from his primary financial resource into his new and far more powerful master. The shady, threatening private lenders he was so terrified of, the ones he had used as a weapon to try and intimidate me, would be gone. They would be paid off, in full, with my money. They would receive a wire transfer for $400,000, plus a small, and very motivating premium for their silence and cooperation. They would disappear from his life, their threatening emails and phone calls silenced forever. For a few brief, glorious hours, Damien would believe he was safe. He would believe that my okay meant the problem had been solved in the traditional way, a simple, clean and consequence-free bailout from his infinitely wealthy and infinitely weak mother-in-law. But the debt itself, the $400,000 chain around his neck, would not be gone. It would not be forgiven. It would simply be transferred. The ownership of that debt, in a legally binding and irrevocable transaction, would be moved from a group of dangerous strangers to me, or rather to the anonymous, and utterly implacable, financial entity that was the Dubois Family Trust. The brilliance of this maneuver, as Mr. Carter had immediately and enthusiastically understood, was that it gave me absolute and legally protected control. I was no longer the emotional, easily manipulated mother, a target for their psychological blackmail. I was the primary and sole creditor. Under the terms of the original loan agreements, which we now owned, I held all the cards. I could call the loan in at any time. I could dictate the repayment terms. I could, if he missed a single payment, initiate the very asset seizure and legal ruin he had been so terrified of. I owned his failure. While Mr. Carter's team of lawyers and accountants, a group of the sharpest financial minds in the city, began the swift, aggressive and highly confidential work of contacting the creditors and executing the buyout, I began to prepare for the final, symbolic act of this new arrangement, the delivery of the new terms and conditions of his life. I went to my study, but I did not pack a suitcase. My apartment in Geneva was a second life, fully stocked and waiting to be lived. All I needed for my journey was my passport and my purse. Instead, I looked for a box, not a large practical cardboard box for moving. I wanted something with a more symbolic weight, a vessel that would be in itself a part of the message. In my large walk-in dressing room, a room filled with the quiet, elegant clothes of my old life, I found it. On a high shelf covered in a thin layer of dust, was a beautiful empty designer shoebox from a pair of ridiculously expensive shoes I had bought on a whim in Paris years ago and had never once worn. It was a perfect, elegant and deeply ironic vessel for the message I was about to send to my brand-obsessed daughter and her husband. The box was a beautiful, sturdy, glossy black thing, with the name of a famous and astronomically expensive French designer embossed on the lid in elegant silver script. It was a symbol of the world they so desperately wanted to inhabit, a world of effortless, unearned luxury. It was a box that promised a priceless, beautiful treasure inside, and the treasure I was about to place within it was, in its own way, priceless. It was the bill for their entire fraudulent life. The box itself was the first part of the message. It was a beautiful, sturdy, glossy black box, with the name of a famous and astronomically expensive French designer embossed on the lid in elegant silver script. It was a symbol of the world they so desperately wanted to inhabit, a world of effortless, unearned luxury. It was a box that promised a treasure inside, a treasure that they would believe solve all their problems. I began to pack this box not with anger but with the cold, detached precision of a curator assembling a particularly pointed and meaningful exhibit. Each item was chosen for its specific and brutal symbolic meaning. First, I went to my desk and printed out the email I had just received from Mr. Carter. It was a terse and deeply satisfying confirmation. His team of legal and financial sharks had worked with a ruthless efficiency. The buyout was complete. He had attached the new, official and legally binding debt transfer documents. I printed the entire multi-page file. The paper showed, in stark black and white, that Damien's $400,000 debt was no longer owed to a series of shady, anonymous lenders. It was now officially and irrevocably owed to the Dubois Family Trust. And I, Dr. Annalise Dubois, was the sole and absolute trustee. I folded the documents neatly and placed them at the very bottom of the box. This was the foundation of their new reality. Next I went to a small antique box where I kept old mementos and travel souvenirs, a collection of small tangible memories. I found what I was looking for, a small plastic and deeply unglamorous prepaid bus pass. It was from a research trip I had taken to London years ago, a project that had required me to navigate the city's vast and complex public transit system. It was a symbol of a different kind of life, a life without limousines and private cars, a life where one had to wait, to be patient, to plan, to move with the masses. It was a symbol of the life of ordinary people. I placed the bus pass on top of the legal papers. Then came the final, and most devastatingly practical item. Mr. Carter, as part of his comprehensive and enthusiastic execution of my plan, had already secured the next piece of the puzzle. An hour ago, his real estate division had finalized a 1-month prepaid lease on a small, bleak, but clean and safe one-bedroom apartment in a low-income housing complex on the far unfashionable side of the city. It was an apartment for people who were starting over, for people who had nothing. It was the absolute polar opposite of their minimalist glass mansion. He had sent a courier to pick up the keys. They now sat on the polished surface of my antique desk. The keys were attached to a cheap, flimsy plastic tag, the kind a low-budget landlord uses to keep track of their properties. On the tag, written in a shaky blue ballpoint pen, were the words Apt 1C, 452 Gable Street. I picked up the keys. They felt cheap and light in my hand, a stark contrast to the heavy, solid, German-engineered keys to my own home, and to their luxury cars. I dropped them into the box where they landed with a small, pathetic plastic clatter. The exhibit was complete, a beautiful empty designer shoebox, containing not a pair of exquisite handmade shoes, but a thick stack of life-altering debt papers, a cheap bus pass, and the keys to a life of profound and shocking mediocrity. It was a perfect and perfectly cruel summary of their new circumstances. It was a box full of the one thing they had never had to deal with, hard, cold, and inescapable consequences. I placed the lid on the box. The message was ready for delivery. 4 hours after my children had walked out of my house, their hearts full of a triumphant, greedy relief, I was gone. The sleek black and utterly discreet car from the concierge service glided silently away from the curb, leaving my beautiful dark and empty home behind. The driver, a man whose face was a mask of professional impassivity, did not speak. I did not look back. The airport, usually a place of stressful, chaotic energy, was, from the privileged sanctuary of the first-class check-in, a sea of calm efficiency. There were no lines, no crowds. My single small suitcase was whisked away. My passport was stamped with a polite, deferential thud. I moved through it all with a strange, dreamlike detachment. I was a ghost, a woman who was in the process of seamlessly and silently disappearing from her own life, of shedding an old and very heavy skin. I sat in the quiet, exclusive first-class lounge, a glass of very expensive champagne in my hand, the bubbles a silent, celebratory effervescence. From my seat I had a view of the tarmac, of the massive, beautiful airplanes that were to me symbols of freedom, of escape. I made my final call. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice a calm, quiet murmur against the hushed, international backdrop of the lounge. "I am at the airport. My flight to Geneva leaves in 1 hour. I trust your travels will be pleasant, Dr. Dubois," he said, his voice a model of professional discretion, betraying none of the immense satisfaction I knew he must be feeling. "And I can confirm that all your instructions from this afternoon have been carried out to the letter. The trust now legally and irrevocably owns Mr. Damien's entire outstanding debt. The creditors have been paid and silenced." "Excellent," I said, a small, cold and deeply satisfying smile touching my lips. "Then there are just a few final instructions for the morning." "Of course, doctor," he replied, and I could almost hear the sound of him picking up a pen ready to take notes. "I am at your service." "First," I said, my voice as precise and as clear as a surgical instrument, "tomorrow morning at precisely 9 o'clock, I want you to dispatch a bonded and insured locksmith to my house at 450 Rosewood Lane. He is to change all the locks. The main doors, the garden gates, the garage, everything. My children's keys are as of that moment to be rendered completely and utterly useless." "A locksmith. 9 a.m. Consider it done," he said. "Second," I continued, "I have left a box on the small marble-topped table in the front entryway. It is a black designer shoebox. It is for my daughter and her husband. I want you to instruct the locksmith that his final task, after securing the property, is to place that box on the center of the front porch, where they cannot possibly miss it. A black shoebox, on the porch. Understood." And finally, Mr. Carter, I said, taking a final satisfying sip of my champagne. As of my departure tonight, you are to forward all my personal and professional mail to my new permanent address in Geneva. The house on Rosewood Lane is to be maintained by my staff, but it is no longer my primary residence. Please also inform my housekeeper and my gardener of the change, and assure them that their positions are of course secure. Their salaries will be increased by 10%, as a bonus for their loyalty. I had not just left for a trip, I had immigrated. I had in a few short surgical hours, completely and utterly erased myself from the life they had known, from the country they had taken for granted. All instructions will be followed to the letter, doctor, he said, and I could hear the profound and deeply satisfied respect in his voice. And may I say, on a personal note, it has been a distinct and profound pleasure to execute these transactions on your behalf. The pleasure has been all mine, Ben, I said, using his first name for the first time in our 30-year professional relationship. I'll be in touch when I land. I hung up the phone. A quiet, polite voice over the lounge's intercom announced the final boarding call for my flight to Geneva. I stood up, my small elegant carry-on bag in my hand, and walked toward the gate, toward my new life. I felt no sadness. I felt no regret. I felt only a vast and deeply liberating sense of peace. The operation was a success. The patient, my own life, which had been suffering from a malignant and invasive cancer of entitlement, had been saved. The next morning at precisely 10 o'clock, a gleaming black Range Rover, a vehicle whose monthly lease payment was more than most people's mortgages, and which I knew was 2 months behind in its payments, pulled up to the curb in front of my house. Sarah and Damien got out. They were a picture of triumphant casual chic, the very embodiment of a life lived without consequence. Sarah was in a stylish, all-white pantsuit that probably cost more than my first car, her face hidden behind enormous designer sunglasses. Damien was in a crisp, unbuttoned linen shirt, his expression one of relaxed, arrogant confidence. They were here to collect their prize. They were here to pick up their check for $400,000. They had given me my orders, and they had, with the absolute unshakable faith of the deeply and chronically entitled, assumed that I had followed them to the letter. They were not here to plead or to check. They were here to make a withdrawal. They walked up the stone path to my front door, their steps a confident, proprietary march. They were not just visiting, they were arriving at their personal private bank, a financial institution that had never, not once, denied them a loan. Sarah reached the front door first. She took out her key, the key to her childhood home, a key she had not had to use in years, but had kept as a symbol of her eternal access, and slid it into the lock. She turned it, and nothing happened. The key met the solid, unyielding and completely alien resistance of a lock that no longer recognized it. A small, ugly frown of annoyance creased her perfect, botoxed brow. "What the?" she muttered. "Mom must have put the deadbolt on. The old woman is so paranoid." She stepped back and rang the doorbell, not with a polite, single press but with a series of sharp, impatient and demanding jabs. The cheerful musical chime echoed from within the silent, empty house, but the door of course remained closed. Damien, a look of irritation on his own handsome face, tried his key. The result was the same. The lock was a silent, metallic and deeply uncooperative stranger. The confident, triumphant expressions on their faces began to falter, replaced by a dawning, irritated confusion. "What the hell is going on?" Damien said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "Is she not here? She said she'd have it today. She knew we were coming." He tried the handle, rattling it with a frustrated, impotent anger. They peered through the lidded glass sidelight windows, their hands cupped against the glass. But the house was dark, the heavy silk curtains drawn. There was no sign of life. Their irritation was now beginning to curdle into a real, and deeply unfamiliar sense of unease. The world, for the first time in their adult lives, was not conforming to their expectations. The bank, their own private personal bank, was inexplicably closed. The transaction was not proceeding as scheduled. A cold, dawning sense of confusion, the first faint and deeply unsettling whisper of a world turned upside down, began to creep into their perfect sun-drenched morning. The check was not waiting, and the doors were locked. It was Damien who saw it first. His eyes scanning the porch for any sign of a note, of an explanation, finally settled on the object that had been placed in the precise geometric center of my welcome mat. "What's that?" he said, his voice a low murmur of confusion, pointing to the top step of the wide stone porch. There, sitting with a stark minimalist elegance that would have in any other context appealed to my daughter's aesthetic, was the box. A single, elegant, glossy black shoebox. A silent, mysterious object against the traditional old-world architecture of the house. On top of the lid was a small, simple and very expensive-looking cream-colored card, the kind I used for my personal correspondence. On it, written in my neat, surgical and now deeply ominous script, were 4 simple words, "For Sarah and Damien." They stared at it for a long moment, their minds struggling to process this new, unexpected and deeply strange piece of the puzzle. "What the hell is this?" Sarah said, her voice a mixture of her earlier annoyance and a new sharp and rising note of apprehension. "Is this some kind of game? A scavenger hunt for the money?" "She is so dramatic." "I don't know," Damien said, his own voice now lacking its usual arrogant confidence. "Maybe the check is inside. Or maybe it's instructions for a wire transfer. You know how she is, always has to be a little theatrical." Sarah, still annoyed but now deeply and uncomfortably curious, walked up the steps and picked up the box. It was surprisingly and disappointingly heavy. She held it in her hands, a look of profound suspicion on her beautiful, anxious face. She was a woman who had been promised a check for nearly $500,000. A check that was the only thing standing between her and a life of public humiliation and financial ruin. And she had been given a shoebox. "Well, open it," Damien urged, his own anxiety now palpable, his performance of detached confidence completely gone. They did not open it on the porch. The performance of their lives, though faltering, was not yet over. They could not risk a public display of whatever this was. They took the box and walked back to their car, a private, leather-lined space for what they still believed, still desperately hoped, would be a private and very lucrative financial transaction. They got in, the expensive leather seats of the Range Rover sighing under their weight. They placed the box on the center console between them, a silent, black coffin of their own hopes and expectations. Sarah looked at the box, at the elegant silver lettering of the designer's name, a name she revered, a symbol of the very life she was so desperate to maintain, a flicker of her old materialistic hope. A deeply ingrained and now utterly pathetic optimism returned. Maybe this was a gift, a strange, theatrical peace offering. Maybe it was a pair of ridiculously expensive, custom-made shoes, with a very, very large check tucked inside. With a hand that was not quite steady, she lifted the lid. The discovery was about to be made. The final, terrible and beautifully, brutally packaged truth was about to be revealed. They opened the box, and for a long, silent and deeply confusing moment, they just stared. Their minds, so attuned to the language of luxury, of brands, of aesthetics, could not process the strange and deeply, deeply wrong collection of objects inside. There were no shoes. There was no soft, rustling tissue paper. There was no thick, creamy envelope containing a check. There was no treasure. There was only a collection of strange, ugly and deeply insulting artifacts from a world they did not know. The first thing Sarah saw lying on top like a cheap plastic shroud was the bus pass. She picked it up between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect, a piece of street trash that had somehow found its way into this temple of luxury. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of revulsion and pure uncomprehending confusion. "Is this a joke?" Beneath the bus pass was the set of keys. Not the heavy, satisfyingly solid keys to a new car or a new house, but a cheap, flimsy and deeply pathetic set of keys on a plastic tag. The ugly, handwritten scrawl, Apt 1C 4050 Gable Street, a final brutal insult. They stared at it, the address meaning nothing to them, but the sheer unglamorous ugliness of the object a jarring, offensive presence in the pristine leather and wood interior of their luxury car. And then they saw what was underneath. It was not a bed of satin. It was a thick, terrifying stack of legal documents. Damien, his hands now trembling, reached in and lifted them out. His eyes scanned the top page. He saw his own name. He saw the name of his failed, pathetic company. He saw the names of his vicious, threatening, and now fully paid-off creditors. And he saw the final, terrifying, red-stamped number that had been the source of all his sleepless nights. But then he saw the new page, the cover sheet that had been attached to the front, the page that was not part of his original terrible file. He saw the official, intimidating letterhead of the Dubois Family Trust, and he saw the legal, jargon-filled paragraph that explained, in cold, hard, and utterly inescapable terms, that the ownership of his debt, his failure, his ruin, had been legally and completely transferred. "What is it?" Sarah hissed, her voice a tight, anxious whisper. her eyes still fixed on the pathetic plastic keys in her hand. What does it say? Damien's handsome, tanned face had gone a pale, sickly greenish-white. He could not speak. He could not form the words. He just handed her the papers, his hand shaking so badly the papers rattled. She read them. Her perfectly glossed lips moved silently, her mind, so attuned to the nuances of branding and image and social media engagement, now struggling with the hard, ugly and unforgiving language of legal contracts and financial obligations. And then she understood, her eyes wide and disbelieving at first, slowly narrowed, her mind finally, and completely comprehending the full, horrifying and absolutely catastrophic truth of their situation. Their mother had not paid off the debt. She had bought it. She was not their savior. She was their new creditor. The box was not a gift. It was an invoice, and a set of instructions for their new and deeply profoundly impoverished life. The scream when it came was not a human sound. It was a raw, guttural and utterly primal roar of pure animalistic horror and rage. It was the sound of two deeply chronically entitled, and completely unprepared people, suddenly and violently being confronted with the first real and truly devastating consequence of their entire pampered and utterly fraudulent lives. They screamed, and they screamed, and they screamed, there in the quiet, sterile luxury of their Range Rover, on the quiet, tree-lined street of the beautiful, and now impenetrably locked house that was no longer their bank, but a silent, mocking monument to their own, spectacular and richly deserved, downfall. The final scene of this story does not take place in a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with the ugly, impotent screams of the newly dispossessed. It takes place in a beautiful, modern and serenely quiet apartment, overlooking the placid blue expanse of Lake Geneva. It is a beautiful morning, the sun is glinting off the water, and the snow-capped peaks of the Alps are visible in the distance. A breathtaking, almost unreal vista of peace and tranquility. I, Dr. Annalise Dubois, am sitting on my balcony, a cup of strong black and exquisitely brewed coffee in my hand. The air is cool, clean and utterly profoundly peaceful. This is my new beginning, a life of quiet, of solitude, of a peace that I have not just earned but have finally, and decisively claimed for myself. My phone, a new sleek and entirely private device, buzzes softly on the small glass table beside me. It is not a frantic, demanding and abusive call from my daughter. It is a discreet, encrypted email from Mr. Ben Carter, my loyal and efficient financial manager. The subject line is simple, professional and deeply, deeply satisfying. Update on the DT account. DT for Damien Thorn. A new asset, a new file, a new problem to be managed. The body of the email is equally concise. Good morning, Dr. Dubois. I trust you are settling in well. This is to confirm that the first monthly debt repayment of $5,000 from Mr. and Mrs. Damien Thorn, as per the aggressive repayment schedule we have established, is due on the 1st of the upcoming month. Shall I send the first official and legally binding reminder notice? I look out at the calm blue water of the lake. I think of my daughter, of my son-in-law. I do not feel anger. I do not feel hatred. I do not even feel pity. I feel only a vast and deeply cleansing sense of detachment. They are no longer my children. In the financial sense, they are an account, a liability that is now finally, and for the foreseeable future, being paid back. They are in their small, bleak, but I am assured, very clean, apartment on Gable Street. Damien, I am sure, is desperately, and for the very first time in his life, looking for a real job. Sarah is, I am sure, discovering the quiet, humbling horror of a life without unlimited funds. A life where her brand has no currency. They are, perhaps, for the first time, being forced to become adults. It is the hardest and most necessary gift I have ever given them. I pick up my phone. My fingers, the same fingers that once performed miracles of precision and control in the delicate microscopic world of the human brain, are steady. I type one single, beautiful, and utterly final word in response to Mr. Carter's email. Absolutely. I press send. I take a sip of my coffee. The sun is warm on my face. A new day, a new life has begun, and it is entirely and completely my own.